The CEO took his mistress abroad on a luxury vacation, strictly instructing his estate manager to keep it a secret from his wife. But the very next day, the manager trembled as he delivered the news. "Sir, the madam has sold the vacation estate, taken over $1.5 million in cash, and vanished." Hearing this, he froze on the spot, because for the first time, he understood that his always silent wife had truly left him. The sky over San Francisco that morning poured a light, relentless drizzle, the kind that was not heavy but enough to make the asphalt glisten like a coat of cold oil. The ancient trees lining the exclusive Seacliff neighborhood stood dead still, as if holding their breath for something impending. Inside the sprawling 10,000-square-foot private estate, Richard Sterling sat in the living room, smoking his third cigarette since 4 in the morning. The warm, golden light cast shadows over the face of the successful, elegant 40-year-old man who frequently appeared on television as a model entrepreneur. No one would believe that just hours ago, he was holding his mistress at a luxury resort in Street Barts, only to abruptly book a flight back to the United States in an unprecedented state of panic. Not far away, Arthur, the family's estate manager of over 20 years, stood by the window looking out at the rain, his heart heavy as a stone. He had not slept all night. From the moment he received Richard's call from the airport layover in Miami saying he had to return immediately, Arthur knew the secret was out. But what terrified him was not his boss's wrath, but the serene look in Eleanor's eyes before she left 2 days prior. That woman was more frightening the calmer she became. Arthur clearly remembered that morning. Eleanor wore a simple cream dress, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Her face showed zero signs of a woman who had just discovered her husband's infidelity. She ate her oatmeal just like any other day, asked Arthur if he had slept well, and reminded the landscaping staff to tend to the orchids in the garden so they would bloom on time. That absolute normalcy was what sent a chill down his spine. He knew her too well. In his 20 years managing this household, he had only seen Eleanor cry exactly once, on the day her mother passed away. Otherwise, no matter how massive the crisis, she had never lost her composure in front of anyone. The sound of tires screeching to a halt at the front gates jolted Arthur back to reality. Richard was home. The door swung open, and he stepped quickly inside. His dress shirt was wrinkled from the long flight, his eyes bloodshot from sleep deprivation. The moment he saw Arthur, he demanded, "Where is she?" Arthur bowed his head. "Sir, the madam is no longer here." "What do you mean she is no longer here?" "The madam left the estate 2 days ago." Richard gripped his leather duffel bag so tightly his veins popped. "Where did she go?" "She said she was returning to her parents' home." Richard let out a brief sigh of relief, but the feeling lasted only seconds. Arthur slowly pulled a stack of documents from his briefcase and placed them on the coffee table. "I believe you should look at this, sir." Richard opened the file, and upon reading the first line, the color drained from his face. It was the deed of transfer for the vacation estate in Aspen. Seller, Eleanor Vance. Transaction value, $8.5 million. Completed yesterday. His hands began to shake. Impossible. Arthur lowered his head further. "The madam has already sold the estate, sir." Richard shot up from the sofa. "Who gave her permission to sell it?" But the moment he shouted, he froze. He suddenly remembered that the Aspen estate was under Eleanor's name long before they were married. It was a premarital asset she brought into the marriage, and no one had the right to stop her from selling it. Richard looked as if all the blood had been drained from his body. Seconds later, he lunged forward, snatching the rest of the paperwork from the folder. The more he read, the more violently his hands shook. 5 luxury vehicles had their titles transferred. An investment portfolio worth $15 million had been completely liquidated. The tech shares under Eleanor's name in his private company had been reassigned. In total, millions of dollars in liquid assets and her entire personal net worth had vanished from this marriage in just 3 days. Richard snapped his head up. "Where is she?" Arthur remained silent for a few seconds before answering. "No one has been able to contact the madam." The room sank into a silence so deep that the sound of rain hitting the patio was deafening. Richard stood paralyzed in the center of the massive living room, feeling as though someone had just taken a sledgehammer to his skull. He never imagined Eleanor would actually leave. Throughout their 5 years of marriage, he always believed she loved him too much to ever walk away. Even when he was cold, when he used business trips as excuses to be away constantly, when he spent millions on a young model named Chloe, she had never caused a single scene. That exact silence made him think she was weak. Until today. He suddenly recalled their final phone call 4 days ago. He was lying next to Chloe in Street Barts when Eleanor called. Her voice was as gentle as always. "Are you very busy?" He had been annoyed. "I am on a business trip. Whatever it is, we will talk when I get back." "I see." She only said those 2 words and hung up. At the time, he felt relieved, thinking everything was still under control. Remembering it now, he realized that was the voice of a woman who had already finalized her decisions. Arthur looked at his boss, his mind a tangled mess. For years, he had respected Richard, believing him to be a brilliant man who provided for his family. Until 3 months ago, when he accidentally saw Richard holding the young model inside a private car in a hotel garage. Only then did he understand it was all a facade. What broke Arthur's heart the most was that Eleanor never deserved to be treated this way. When she married into the family, the entire West Coast business elite knew she was the sole heiress to a massive real estate empire, yet she never displayed an ounce of arrogance. When the staff fell ill, she personally ensured they received top medical care. When Arthur was short on his college tuition, she quietly transferred $15,000 to his account, telling him to keep it a secret so he would not feel embarrassed. A woman like that, ultimately betrayed in the very home she had used her own money to furnish. Richard suddenly slammed the stack of papers onto the table. "No, she cannot do this to me." Arthur looked up. "Sir." Richard gritted his teeth. "I have to see her." Right at that moment, his phone rang with a video call from Chloe. The second he answered, her voice echoed, full of frustration. "Why did you leave me behind in Street Barts? I had to book my own commercial flight back, and the paparazzi photographed me at the airport." Richard had no patience to coddle her. He snapped, "Shut up." Chloe froze for a few seconds before changing her tone. "What happened?" Richard did not answer immediately. He looked around the expansive mansion, feeling a bitter cold he had never experienced before, because he finally understood that the woman who had quietly stood behind him for 5 years had truly vanished. And the most terrifying part was not the money she took, but that from start to finish, her departure was too calm, too clean, as if she had been preparing for this for a very long time, and he had not noticed a thing. At that exact moment, in a different location, a black SUV was driving quietly down the Pacific Coast Highway. Eleanor sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the thick fog rolling over the ocean outside the window. Her phone vibrated continuously with calls from Richard, but she did not answer. Next to her rested a brown leather folder containing all the asset transfer documents finalized that morning. The driver asked softly, "Madam, are we heading straight there?" Eleanor remained silent for a few seconds before giving a slight nod. "Yes, to the final step." The car sped through the cold, gray rain, while behind her, a seemingly perfect marriage was beginning to collapse entirely. Richard barely closed his eyes for the rest of the night. The massive estate remained lit until dawn, while Arthur brought up tea several times, only to step away quietly as his boss's complexion grew worse by the hour. The man who always appeared unfazed before corporate partners, the media, and hundreds of subordinates now sat motionless on the sofa, looking like someone who had just lost something incredibly vital that he never saw coming. As the sky brightened, he stood up abruptly. "Prepare the car," Arthur asked softly. "Are you planning to go to your in-laws' estate, sir? Do you even have to ask?" His voice was hoarse after nearly 20 hours awake. But what caught Arthur's attention most was the panic in his eyes. In all these years, Arthur had never seen Richard so terrified. It was not the anger of losing money, nor the frustration of being opposed, but the sheer dread of a man realizing that everything he took for granted was slipping through his fingers. The car sped down the highway toward Carmel by the Sea. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a heavy, oppressive gray, mirroring the mood inside the vehicle. Richard continuously called Eleanor, but the line only offered long rings before going silent. By the 15th call, he slammed the phone onto the leather seat. "She is intentionally avoiding me." Arthur, sitting in the passenger seat, did not dare speak. In his heart, he knew Eleanor was not the type to act on pure emotion. Once she decided to leave, it meant she had prepared everything long in advance. That was what made it terrifying. Over an hour later, the car stopped before the wrought iron gates of the Vance family estate. The historic, sprawling property sat isolated on a coastal bluff, featuring a massive koi pond dotted with white water lilies near the entrance. From a young age to his adulthood, Richard had visited this place many times, but he had never felt such suffocating pressure as he did today. As soon as the gates opened, he stepped out of the car quickly. The elderly groundskeeper, Thomas, stood waiting on the porch, his demeanor as calm as ever. "You arrived early, Mr. Sterling. I want to see Eleanor." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "The young miss is resting." "I am sorry, but Mr. Vance instructed me not to receive guests." Richard clenched his fists. "I am her husband." Thomas looked at him for a few seconds before speaking softly. "But this is the Vance estate." Just that one sentence was enough to make Richard's face stiffen. For years, he knew his wife's family wielded immense power, but because Eleanor never used that power to pressure him, he had slowly forgotten. Only today did he truly feel the vast chasm between himself and the Vance dynasty. Just then, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the courtyard. "Let him in." Richard turned to see Theodore Vance, Eleanor's father, walking down the stone steps. The man in his 60s wore a thin, gray cashmere sweater. His hair was heavily silvered, but his gaze remained so razor-sharp that it was hard to hold eye contact. Richard lowered his head. "Good morning, Theodore." Theodore did not respond immediately. He stared at his son-in-law for a very long time before speaking with icy detachment. "Come inside." The atmosphere in the living room was suffocating. A maid brought tea and quietly retreated. Richard sat across from his father-in-law, feeling smaller than he had in years. Theodore set his teacup down. "You came looking for my daughter." "Yes. She does not want to see you." Richard tried to maintain his composure. "I want to explain." Theodore let out a dry laugh. "Explain what? Taking your mistress out of the country, or using company funds to buy a penthouse for her?" Richard's face went paper white. He never expected them to know every granular detail. Theodore looked straight into his son-in-law's eyes. "I warned Eleanor. I told her you were a man of excessive ambition, that sooner or later your heart would change, but she refused to listen." Richard's voice was raspy. "I know I was wrong." "You do not know a thing." Theodore's voice was even but grew colder with every word. "If you truly knew you were wrong, you would not have let my daughter suffer in silence for half a year." Richard bowed his head in silence. Right then, light footsteps echoed from the staircase. He spun around. Eleanor was standing on the landing. She wore a simple white knit dress, her hair cascading softly over her shoulders. Her face was as serene as always, but her eyes were far colder than they had ever been. Richard immediately stood up. "Eleanor." She looked at him for a few seconds before slowly descending the stairs. The living room was so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock was deafening. She stopped just a few steps away from him. "You returned faster than I anticipated." Richard stared at her. "You sold the Aspen estate." "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if hearing a very strange question. "It was my property." Richard choked on his words for a moment before stepping closer. "Eleanor, things are not what you think." For the first time since they reunited, she laughed, but the smile lacked its former warmth. "So what do you think I am thinking?" Richard tried to speak, but she pulled her phone from her pocket, opened a video, and placed it on the coffee table. On the screen was footage of him holding Chloe in a resort pool in Street Barts. The sound of their laughter echoed clearly through the dead-silent room. Richard's face lost all its color. "I hired a private investigator to follow you 3 months ago," Eleanor said softly, but each word cut into his skin. "The penthouse in Beverly Hills, the cars you bought her, the luxury vacations you took her on. I know about all of it." Richard's throat went dry. "Eleanor, I can explain." "There is no need," she interrupted. "I am not here to listen to a man's excuses for his infidelity." Saying that, she pulled a stack of papers and placed them on the table. "These are the divorce papers." Richard stood completely paralyzed. The hand gripping his folder visibly shook. For some reason, an image of Eleanor from 5 years ago flashed through his mind, standing under the amber lights of a hotel ballroom in her wedding dress, smiling gently as she said that just being by his side was enough. He never imagined a day would come when she would hand him divorce papers herself. "I will not sign," his voice cracked. Eleanor looked at him for a long time before asking softly, "Do you really think you still have a choice?" Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. Theodore asked, "What is it?" Eleanor remained silent for a few seconds before answering. "The Los Angeles branch just reported that someone is secretly trying to transfer the tech shares under my name." Theodore's expression instantly darkened, while Richard froze. Because the only person who knew about that specific share account, other than Eleanor, was one person: Chloe. Eleanor slowly looked up at her husband. Her eyes no longer held disappointment, only absolute zero coldness. The massive living room of the Vance estate fell into a suffocating stillness. Outside, the wind began to howl, branches scraping together with a sound that sent chills down the spine. Richard stood motionless in the center of the room, his eyes glued to the face of the woman who had been so gentle with him for 5 years, but who now felt so foreign he did not even know how to open his mouth. His worst fear had finally materialized. It was not just that Eleanor knew about his affair, it was that she had begun to strike back. Theodore stood up slowly, looking at his daughter with deep concern. "Which shares?" Eleanor took a shallow breath and set her phone down. "The Los Angeles branch says someone used a forged power of attorney to access my investment account. They have not completed the transfer because the bank called to verify it." Theodore immediately scowled. "Who is behind this?" Eleanor did not answer right away. She just stared straight at her husband. That gaze made Richard's blood run cold. Do you want to say it yourself? Richard immediately shook his head. I did not know about this. Really? I swear. His voice had lost all its usual confidence. He genuinely had no idea someone was touching Eleanor's accounts. Despite cheating, he never once thought about stealing his wife's money. At least, that was his truth. But then a sudden thought flashed through his mind, making his face change color. Because only Chloe knew Eleanor possessed those shares. Months ago, while intoxicated, he had accidentally mentioned that his wife held nearly $5 million in tech stocks. Chloe had jokingly asked if Eleanor would split it with him in a divorce, and he had just laughed it off. Thinking back on it now, a cold sweat broke out over his spine. Eleanor watched his facial expressions and gave a faint, cynical smile. It seems you have guessed who it is. Richard clenched his fists. I will handle it. No need, she replied calmly. I have already contacted my attorney. Theodore finally spoke up, his voice dropping an octave. Richard, out of respect for the fact that you were once my daughter's husband, I have maintained my courtesy until now. But if that woman dares to touch the Vance family's assets, this matter will no longer be simple. Richard lowered his head. I apologize. Do not apologize to me. Theodore looked him dead in the eye. The person you need to apologize to is my daughter. Eleanor, who had been silent, turned and walked toward the glass doors, looking out at the pond. Her voice was incredibly soft, but the softer it was, the heavier it weighed on the listener. Truthfully, until last week, I still wanted to save this marriage. Richard stiffened. She continued. I thought if you were just momentarily infatuated, you would eventually come back. I gave myself so many reasons to forgive you. Hearing that, Richard's throat tightened painfully. Eleanor, but the day you took her to Street Bart's, she turned to look at him, her eyes red for the first time since he arrived. You wore the exact watch I gifted you for our 5th anniversary. The room went dead silent. Richard instantly remembered the watch. On the day they left, Chloe had taken a photo of his wrist and posted it online to flaunt their luxury trip, completely unaware that Eleanor saw everything. He felt his heart ache in a very unfamiliar way. For years, he thought Eleanor was the kind of woman who would silently endure any pain. He never noticed how carefully she selected every gift, never noticed she memorized the birthdays of every staff member, and never noticed that every time he came home late from a business trip, the living room lights were left on until midnight. He thought those things were just given. Only on the verge of losing her did he realize there might not be another woman in the world who would treat him like that. His phone suddenly vibrated violently. It was Chloe. Richard stared at the screen for a few seconds before shutting it off completely. But seconds later, text messages flooded in. Where are you? Is that woman making things difficult for you? Talk to me. Then a photo arrived. Chloe was sitting in the Beverly Hills penthouse he had bought her, holding a glass of wine, her face filled with frustration. At that exact moment, Eleanor received a call from her attorney. She answered, Yes, Harvey. The lawyer's voice came through clearly. Eleanor, the bank just confirmed. The person who brought the forged power of attorney was Chloe's personal assistant. Richard felt like a bucket of ice water had been thrown in his face. Eleanor said nothing more, replying simply, I understand. The call ended, and the air grew terrifyingly heavy. A long time passed before Richard managed a raspy whisper. I truly did not know she did this. Eleanor looked at him for a long time before asking, But she did all those things because she thought you were going to marry her, didn't she? Richard froze. Just then, Theodore spoke up with icy precision. Do you know what the most ridiculous part of this is? Richard remained silent. My daughter was married to you for 5 years and never took a single dime from you. When your company was in crisis, she gave you the money to save it. Meanwhile, the woman you have kept for less than a year is already calculating how to steal from my family. Every word cut like a knife. Richard collapsed into an armchair, burying his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly stupid. He traded a wife like Eleanor for a few months of fresh passion. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching echoed from the courtyard. A frantic maid ran inside. Sir, madam, Miss Chloe is here. The entire room froze. Richard shot up. What is she doing here? Before the maid could answer, the rapid clicking of high heels echoed from the hallway. Seconds later, Chloe appeared at the living room entrance. She wore a tight black designer dress, her hair slightly disheveled from the rush, but what caught everyone's attention was the sheer panic on her face. The moment she saw Richard, she lunged toward him. You have to save me. Richard snapped. What are you doing here? Chloe looked like she was on the verge of tears. Someone is investigating me. My bank accounts have been frozen. Eleanor stood a short distance away, quietly observing the young woman. This was the first time she was meeting the mistress who ruined her marriage face to face. Chloe looked over at her. The two women faced each other in silence. One frantic, one chillingly calm. Then, unexpectedly, Chloe gripped her designer bag, stared straight at Eleanor, and said something that stunned the room. "Do you think you have won?" Eleanor's eyes shifted slightly, while Richard felt an intense premonition that something terrible was about to happen. After Chloe's words, the room felt as if it had turned to ice. Even Arthur, standing near the door, felt his heart pound. No one expected a young girl to stand in the middle of the Vance estate and speak to Eleanor in such a tone. Theodore's face immediately darkened. "What did you just say?" Chloe faltered for a second when she met Theodore's lethal gaze, but she tried to maintain her bravado. Perhaps from the moment she walked in, she had prepared herself for this confrontation. Richard stepped forward quickly. "Chloe, leave right now." "I will not leave." Her voice trembled with agitation. "Do you think you can still hide it?" "Her people are trying to destroy me." Eleanor remained still by the glass door, her gaze terrifyingly serene. "No one is destroying you." Chloe let out a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so innocent. But since this morning, all my brand endorsements have been canceled. My accounts are frozen, and even the property management in Beverly Hills had investigators show up regarding the title. Who else but you could do that?" Richard snapped his head toward his wife. "Did you really do this?" She did not answer immediately, eventually speaking in a soft tone. "I am only taking back what belongs to me." Chloe gripped her bag tighter. "But Richard promised to marry me." The atmosphere instantly plummeted. Richard growled, "Shut up." But Chloe was done holding back. She glared at Richard, her eyes bloodshot. "You told me all I had to do was wait for the divorce and I would be the new Mrs. Sterling. You said she was cold, that she lived like a ghost in your house. You said you never truly loved her." Richard's face lost all color. Theodore let out a cold laugh. "I see." Eleanor remained silent, but that silence frightened Richard more than any screaming match. He stepped in front of his wife. "Eleanor, listen to me. Did you really say those things?" Her voice was feather light. Richard choked for a second before his voice cracked. "I was drunk." Chloe immediately burst into tears. "Are you trying to wash your hands of everything now? All the money you spent on me, all the promises you made to me, were they all lies?" Richard turned to her, his eyes flashing with absolute disgust for the first time. "Keep your mouth shut." "Keep my mouth shut so you can crawl back to her?" Chloe practically screamed. "Do you think she even wants you anymore? Someone like her can have whatever she wants. What about me? I threw away my career for you." Eleanor suddenly let out a soft laugh. The sound was quiet, but enough to make Chloe freeze. She looked at the young woman for a long time before speaking. "Do you really believe a man who betrays his wife will stay loyal to you?" Chloe went rigid. "You lost from the very beginning," Eleanor said in an even tone. "Because a man who can abandon his wife for you will eventually abandon you for someone else." The room was dead silent. Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest, unsure if it was from the insult or the realization that Eleanor had completely changed. The woman before him was no longer the one who silently stood in his shadow. She was calm, sharp, and so painfully rational that he felt the distance between them was now impossible to close. Right then, Eleanor's phone vibrated again. It was Harvey, her lawyer. She answered, "Yes, Harvey." The lawyer spoke rapidly. "Eleanor, I just received an update. Someone is trying to sell your shares in the logistics firm." Theodore shot up from his seat. "Again?" Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Who is listed on the transaction?" "An intermediary firm in Miami, but the direct contact was Chloe's assistant." Everyone in the room turned to look at Chloe, whose face turned completely white. "No, I did not do that." Richard's voice turned deadly. "Are you still lying?" Chloe shook her head in sheer panic. "I just wanted to keep something for myself. I have been with you for nearly a year, and now you want to just throw me away?" Theodore's voice cut through the air. "Did you really think my family's assets were something you could touch just because you felt like it?" Chloe blanched. Eleanor slowly walked toward her. They stood facing each other, mere feet apart. "I never hated you." Chloe looked up at her. "But you are destroying me." "No." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "The only thing destroying you is your own greed." Chloe bit her lips so hard it bled. She understood that from the moment she set foot in this house, she had lost completely. The Vance family did not need to do anything drastic. A single word from them was enough to close every door in her industry. Because in this country, there are people who do not even need to raise their voices to erase someone from the game. Richard looked at Chloe for a long time before speaking exhaustedly. "I will give you a sum of money. After that, leave California." Chloe laughed like she had lost her mind. "So in the end, you still choose her?" "Enough." His voice dropped. "I was wrong from the very beginning." Chloe stood dead still for a few seconds. Suddenly, she pulled her phone from her purse and threw it onto the table. "Do you people think I am an idiot?" Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Chloe sneered. "On that phone is an audio recording of you promising to transfer assets to my name after the divorce." Richard's expression morphed completely, while Eleanor furrowed her brow for the first time. Chloe stared directly at Eleanor. "If you don't let me live in peace, I will leak it all online. Let us see how the media spins the story of a major CEO cheating and shifting assets to his mistress." Richard lunged to grab the phone, but Chloe stepped back quickly. "Do not touch me." The room descended into chaos. Arthur watched from the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He never expected things to go this far. Eleanor remained the calmest person in the room. She looked at Chloe for a few seconds before asking a question that stunned everyone. "How much do you want?" Chloe froze. Richard whipped his head toward his wife. "Eleanor." She did not look at her husband, only at Chloe. "Speak." Chloe swallowed hard. $2 million. Even Theodore frowned at the number, but Eleanor just gave a faint smile. "You think that recording is worth $2 million? Chloe maintained her rigid posture. "If I leak it, Richard's company will lose tens of millions." Eleanor gave a slight nod. "You are not stupid." Then she turned to Richard. "Do you see now?" He clenched his fist so tightly his veins bulged. "I will fix this." "No." She looked at her husband for a long time. "This time, you have to face the consequences yourself." With that, she turned and walked toward the stairs. But before she left, she paused for a few seconds and spoke without looking back. "Oh, and tomorrow morning I will hold a press conference to announce the divorce." Richard stood frozen, while Chloe lost all the remaining color in her face, because she knew that once this became public, it was truly over. That night, barely anyone in the Vance household slept. The atmosphere in the massive estate was so heavy that the staff only dared to walk on their tiptoes. After announcing the press conference, Eleanor went straight to her room and did not come down again. Down in the living room, Richard sat motionless on the sofa for nearly an hour, his eyes as empty as someone who had just been violently ripped from a life he thought he would control forever. Chloe had been escorted out by security long ago, but before leaving, she left the phone containing the recording on the table as a lingering threat. Theodore stood by the window, looking out into the pitch-black courtyard, and spoke with a chilling tone. "How long do you plan on sitting there?" Richard looked up, his voice hoarse. "I want to see Eleanor." "She does not want to see you." "I just want to say a few words." Theodore turned to look at his son-in-law, his eyes void of any sympathy. "Say what? Do you think this can still be salvaged?" Richard gripped his hands together. "I know I was wrong. Every man who gets caught cheating says that." Theodore walked slowly toward him. "But the reason I despise you is not the betrayal." Richard fell silent. "It is because you forced my daughter to endure it alone for months." That sentence made his chest ache violently. Just then, Arthur walked in and whispered, "Sir, the company is calling." Richard immediately stood up to take the call, but within seconds of answering, his face changed entirely. "What?" The voice on the other end was frantic. "Mr. Sterling, the internet is blowing up with rumors of your affair. Someone leaked photos from street barts." Richard's blood ran cold. "Take them down immediately." "We are trying, but it is spreading too fast." Before he could hang up, another call came in. Then another. Within minutes, the entire PR department, partners, and close shareholders were calling relentlessly. The scandal had detonated. Richard stood completely still in the center of the room. He knew better than anyone that in his position, an infidelity scandal was not just a family matter. It would trigger plummeting stock prices, investors pulling out, and a media siege. Everything he built over a decade could collapse in days. And the most terrifying part was that he knew Eleanor had not done this. She was the kind of woman who, if she wanted revenge, would attack directly, not leak gossip. That left only one person: Chloe. He ground his teeth until his jaw ached. Meanwhile, in the Beverly Hills penthouse, Chloe sat curled up on the sofa, aggressively scrolling through her phone. News of Richard and Eleanor was trending within an hour. In the comments, the internet had already launched a manhunt for the mistress. The influencer circle was small, and it did not take long before Chloe's name was dragged into the light. Her hands shook as she called Richard repeatedly, but every call was rejected. By the 10th try, she broke down in actual tears. Chloe never expected things to turn out like this. Initially, she thought she was just dating a rich man, eventually believing Richard would actually divorce his wife to marry her. The houses, the cars, the designer bags, the luxury trips, everything made her believe she had won. Until tonight. For the first time, she understood the vast chasm between an internet-famous model and a truly powerful dynasty. Her phone vibrated abruptly. It was her mother. The moment Chloe answered, she heard crying. "What on earth are you doing, Chloe? Neighbors are coming to our house asking questions." Chloe choked up. "Mom, tell me the truth. Is what they are saying online real?" Chloe could not answer. On the other end of the line, the middle-aged woman wept bitterly. "We may be middle class, but I never raised you to destroy someone else's family." Those words stabbed straight into Chloe's heart. She bit her lip and hung up, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she was truly terrified. Back at the Vance estate, Richard finally saw Eleanor again near midnight. She walked downstairs in simple loungewear, her long hair falling softly over her shoulders. Her face looked slightly exhausted but strangely calm. He immediately stood up. "Eleanor," she looked at him. "You haven't left. I want to talk." She remained silent for a few seconds before sitting on the opposite chair. "Speak." Richard looked at the woman in front of him, his heart twisting. He had never felt the distance between them as vast as he did in this moment. "I did not leak the news online." "I know." He paused. "You know? Chloe did it," she answered softly. "She wants to drag you down with her." Richard buried his face in his hands. "I will handle it." "Can you?" He fell silent. Eleanor looked at her husband for a long time before speaking slowly. "Do you know what I find most tragic?" He looked up. "It is not that you cheated. It is that only when you are on the verge of losing everything do you finally feel regret." Richard felt like he couldn't breathe. She continued, her voice even but every word excruciating. "If your company wasn't in crisis today, if your stocks hadn't plummeted, if Chloe hadn't turned on you, would you have ever come back to find me?" Richard could not answer, because he knew she was right. A long time passed before his raspy voice broke the silence. "I never thought I would lose you." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That was your biggest mistake." Outside, the distant rumble of thunder announced another approaching storm. Richard looked at the woman he once assumed would always be there waiting for him, and felt a pain so intense it was hard to breathe. "Eleanor, give me one more chance." She stayed quiet for a few seconds, then stood up. "There are some things that, once they happen, leave no room for second chances." Saying that, she turned to walk away. But as she climbed the first few steps of the staircase, she suddenly staggered, overcome with dizziness. Her body swayed, causing Richard to panic and rush forward to catch her. "Eleanor!" Before she could stabilize herself, her vision went completely black. Theodore ran over from down the hall, his expression shifting to pure dread. "Call the doctor immediately." The house instantly plunged into chaos, while Richard held his unconscious wife in his arms, feeling genuine terror for the first time, a fear far greater than the threat of losing his company. Because in that split second, he realized that if anything truly happened to Eleanor, he would never forgive himself for the rest of his life. The Vance estate remained brightly lit throughout the night. Since Eleanor collapsed on the stairs, the tension in the house was palpable. The family's private physician was called in immediately, while Richard stood outside her bedroom for nearly an hour, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. Theodore sat in the hallway, his face as cold as stone, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. In all these years, he had never seen his daughter collapse like this. Eleanor was the type of person who, no matter how much pain she was in, would never let anyone see it. Yet tonight, after just a few words with Richard, she had passed out. It proved how much she had been internalizing for months. The bedroom door opened. The middle-aged doctor stepped out, took off his glasses, and sighed softly. "It is not life-threatening, just severe exhaustion and prolonged sleep deprivation." Theodore immediately asked, "Does she need to be hospitalized?" "Not immediately, but her mental state is very fragile. If the extreme stress continues, it could lead to severe clinical depression." Richard, standing a few feet away, felt his heart being crushed. Depression. The word made his ears ring. He never imagined the gentle, always composed woman could be pushed to this breaking point. The doctor looked at him and added, "She is under immense psychological pressure. The family needs to ensure she gets absolute rest." Theodore nodded. "Thank you, doctor." After the doctor left, the hallway fell into silence again. A long time later, Theodore slowly stood up and walked over to his son-in-law. "Go back to San Francisco tonight." Richard looked up. "I want to stay." "There is no need." Theodore's voice remained detached. "She does not want to see you." Richard lowered his head. For the first time in years, the arrogant CEO could no longer maintain his pride. "I know you hate me. I do not hate you." Theodore looked straight into his eyes. "I just feel profound pity for my daughter." Those words choked Richard. Theodore took a few steps away before stopping. "Do you know something? On the day Eleanor insisted on marrying you, She knelt in front of me for nearly 2 hours. Richard froze. She told me that for her entire life, she only wanted to live with the man she loved. I loved my daughter, so I eventually agreed. Theodore let out a sad, quiet laugh. But it seems I made a mistake. With that, he walked into his daughter's room, leaving Richard standing entirely alone in the long, freezing hallway. Richard did not leave that night. He sat in the living room until dawn, his mind chaotic with hundreds of thoughts. His phone vibrated constantly as the internet scandal exploded further. When the morning market opened, Sterling Global's stock tanked, and several major partners began suspending contracts. Oddly, this time, he did not feel the panic of losing money. All he could see was Eleanor's pale face as she fainted. Around 7 in the morning, Arthur walked into the living room, looking deeply concerned. "Sir," Richard looked up. "What is it?" "Miss Chloe is outside the company headquarters." Richard furrowed his brow tightly. "What does she want now?" Arthur swallowed hard. "She is live streaming." Richard shot up. "What?" "She is crying outside the main gates, saying you manipulated her feelings and are trying to wipe your hands clean of all responsibility." The blood in his veins ran cold. Seconds later, his phone rang frantically. His director of PR practically screamed into the receiver. "Mr. Sterling, the live stream has over 200,000 viewers." Richard shut his eyes tightly. He knew better than anyone how terrifying internet mobs could be. A single emotional live stream was enough to send everything spiraling beyond repair. Without waiting another second, he grabbed his keys and drove away from the Vance estate. 40 minutes later, his car screeched to a halt in front of the Sterling Global headquarters in San Francisco. From a distance, he could see a massive crowd of reporters gathered. Chloe stood in the center, her makeup running from her tears, her phone still broadcasting live. The second she saw Richard step out of the car, she lunged at him. "You finally agreed to see me." Richard gritted his teeth. "What the hell are you doing?" Chloe cried louder. "Did I have any other choice? You abandoned me to let everyone brand me a homewrecker, and now you want to cut me off completely." The surrounding reporters instantly aimed their cameras. Richard felt his head pounding like a jackhammer. "Chloe, let's go inside to talk." She shook her head violently. "No, you have to explain yourself in front of everyone today." Suddenly, she turned directly toward the camera broadcasting her live stream. "Everyone thinks I ruined his family, right? But he was the one who told me his marriage was dead." The crowd erupted in whispers. A chill ran down Richard's spine. He never expected her to be this insane. Right at that moment, a woman's voice rang out from behind. "Is that enough?" Everyone turned simultaneously. Eleanor was standing on the steps of the corporate plaza. Richard stood paralyzed. She wore a simple white blouse, her face still pale from her collapse the night before, but her aura was terrifyingly calm. Behind her stood her attorney, Harvey, along with 2 legal assistants. Chloe's face drained of color when she saw her, but she tried to maintain her defiant stance, until Eleanor slowly walked forward. "I just want to ask you one question." Chloe remained silent. "Do you truly love him, or do you love his money?" The entire crowd went dead silent. Chloe bit her lip. "I love him." Eleanor gave a slight nod. "So if he filed for bankruptcy today, what would you do?" Chloe froze. Richard, standing behind them, felt his heart clench. He had never felt as small as he did in this moment. Eleanor continued, "Did you know that when his company was on the verge of bankruptcy 3 years ago, I was the one who handed over $20 million to save it?" Chloe was stunned. "Did you know that the Beverly Hills penthouse you are currently living in was indirectly bought with the returns from my investment in his company?" Chloe's face turned ghostly white. The crowd began to murmur aggressively. Eleanor looked at her for a long time before saying softly, "You cannot steal anything from me." The words were so quiet they were almost a whisper, but they hit Chloe like a physical slap to the face. Right then, Harvey stepped forward and handed her a legal folder. "This is a civil lawsuit for forgery and fraud in attempting to access private financial assets." Chloe's hands shook so violently she dropped her phone. The live stream was still running. Hundreds of thousands of people were watching her ashen face. Meanwhile, Richard stood paralyzed in the background, realizing for the first time that his life could truly never go back to the way it was. After Harvey handed over the lawsuit, the plaza in front of the headquarters practically exploded. Reporters shoved each other, shouting questions, camera shutters firing off deafeningly. Chloe stood frozen like someone who had just been dragged to the bottom of an abyss in front of hundreds of glaring eyes. Her phone lay on the pavement, the screen still on, the live comments scrolling so fast they were unreadable insults, mockery, people digging up her glamorous past posts to humiliate her. Just hours ago, she thought she could use public opinion to force Richard to take her side. But now, everything had violently backfired. Eleanor remained the most composed person in the chaotic crowd. She looked at Chloe for a long time before speaking softly. "You are still young. Do not ruin your own life any further." Chloe snapped her head up, her eyes red. "Are you pitying me?" "No." Eleanor shook her head. "I just find it a waste." That sentence hurt worse than any insult. Chloe bit her lip until it bled, her hands trembling with humiliation. She understood that from today onward, her path in the entertainment industry was permanently sealed. No brand would ever work with someone embroiled in a home-wrecking scandal, let alone one facing a lawsuit over financial fraud. Richard stood in the background watching it all, his mind in unprecedented turmoil. In just a few days, his life had completely flipped. His mistress turned on him, his company was on the brink, his reputation was in ruins, and the wife he thought would always be there was now the furthest person from him. At that moment, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. A man in a gray suit stepped out and walked quickly toward Chloe. The moment she saw him, her expression changed. "Marcus." The man did not reply. He simply bent down, picked up the broadcasting phone, and ended the live stream. Then he turned and bowed his head respectfully to Eleanor. "My apologies, Mrs. Sterling. My sister has caused you trouble." Richard frowned slightly. Only now did he realize Chloe had an older brother. Marcus was in his early 30s, with a stern face and a grounded demeanor entirely different from his sister. He pulled Chloe behind him and continued, "I will take her home." Chloe panicked. "No, I am not going back." "That is enough." Marcus's voice dropped. "Mom had to be admitted to the hospital this morning because of the news about you." Chloe froze. All the color drained from her face, and she began to shake. "Mom? How is Mom?" "Severe hypertension." Marcus looked at his sister with a mix of anger and helplessness. "We never had a lot of money, but Mom and Dad never let us go hungry. And yet, this is the path you chose." Tears streamed down Chloe's face. She wanted to speak, but her throat was choked tight. Marcus turned back. Eleanor remained silent for a few seconds before nodding slightly. "I have no desire to push anyone over the edge." Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest hearing those words. Because he knew better than anyone, the person who had truly been pushed over the edge this entire time was Eleanor. Chloe was finally dragged into the car by her brother. Before leaving, she turned to look at Richard for a long time, her eyes filled with despair and resentment. "In the end, you never really loved me, did you?" Richard stood still. A long time passed before he replied hoarsely, "Perhaps what I loved was just the feeling of something new." Chloe laughed through her tears. "And I traded my entire life for that feeling." The car quickly drove away. The atmosphere in front of the building finally began to settle. But just then, Richard's phone vibrated again. It was his chief financial officer. "Mr. Sterling, we have a massive problem." Richard frowned. "What now?" "The bank just notified us that the $50 million corporate loan might be called in early." His face instantly drained of color because of the scandal. "Yes. The partners believe our company's credibility is severely compromised." Richard closed his eyes for a few seconds. This was the true fatal blow. If the bank pulled their funding now, the company's cash flow would die instantly. Eleanor, standing nearby, had heard almost the entire call, but she said nothing. She quietly turned to head toward her car. Richard suddenly called out after her, "Eleanor?" She stopped. He stepped toward her, his face showing extreme exhaustion for the first time. "I know I have no right to beg you for anything anymore." She remained silent. "But this company, it is my life's work." Her eyes flickered slightly. He continued, his voice rough. "If the bank pulls the funding now, thousands of employees will lose their jobs." For the first time since the scandal broke, Eleanor truly looked into her husband's eyes for an extended moment. In her gaze, there was no longer anger, only deep fatigue. "Are you asking me to save you?" Richard bowed his head. It was the first time in his life he had ever bowed his head to his wife. "I am begging you." Arthur, standing nearby, felt his nose sting. He never thought the day would come when a proud man like Richard would have to say those words. Eleanor clenched her hands slightly, her mind flooded with memories. In the early years of their marriage, Richard stayed up countless nights because the company lacked funding. Once, with a 100-degree fever, he still went to meet investors. She loved him so genuinely back then that she used her own private trust to help him. Yet after everything, this man had betrayed her. A strong gust of wind blew past from the bay, fluttering her coat. Finally, she spoke slowly. "I can help the employees of this company." Richard snapped his head up instantly. "Truly? But not for you." The hopeful smile dying on his lips vanished. She continued, "I will underwrite the loan one last time as a guarantor. After that, we are completely done." Richard felt his heart being crushed in a vice. He knew exactly what that meant. She was using her final act of kindness to sever this marriage permanently. Right then, Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was the hospital. She listened for a few seconds, and her expression completely altered. "What did you say?" Richard immediately grew anxious. "What happened?" She lowered the phone, visibly pale. "My mother just collapsed at the hospital." Theodore, who was standing a short distance away, rushed over. "How is she?" Eleanor's voice trembled for the first time in days. "The doctors say it's her heart." The air around them instantly froze. Richard had a sudden, terrible premonition that the nightmare was still far from over. The news of Margaret Vance's hospitalization shifted the gravity of everything instantly. Eleanor barely had time to process anything before jumping into the car with Theodore to race to the hospital in Monterey. Richard stood alone at the company plaza, watching their car disappear, his mind a chaotic mess. He wanted to follow, but he didn't dare. After everything that had happened, he knew he was now nothing more than an outsider to that family. As the afternoon approached, the sky grew darker. The ocean breeze blowing in from the bay carried a damp chill, while social media continued to explode over the scandal with no signs of cooling down. Sterling Global's stock plunged deeper, and major shareholders began to waver. But Richard had no mind to check the ticker anymore. Only one sentence echoed in his head. Eleanor's mother had a heart attack. In the 5 years he had been their son-in-law, Margaret had always treated him wonderfully. She never looked down on his background, and she would personally cook his favorite meals whenever they visited. Once, when he returned late from a business trip, she specifically called Arthur to ensure Richard had hot soup prepared because he looked like he was losing weight. Yet, in the end, it was Richard who tore that family apart. Richard stood in silence for a long time before suddenly turning to Arthur. "Prepare the car." "Where are you going, sir?" "The hospital." Arthur hesitated. "But Mr. Vance." "I know," Richard cut him off. "Even if they throw me out, I have to go." 40 minutes later, the car stopped in front of the largest private hospital in the region. The 12th floor corridor was stark white under the fluorescent lights. From a distance, Richard could see Theodore standing outside the ICU. The man seemed to have aged a decade in a single afternoon. Eleanor sat on a nearby bench, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. From childhood to adulthood, Eleanor had always viewed her mother as her most gentle anchor. Margaret was kind-hearted and had never raised her voice at anyone. Yet now, she was lying in an emergency room simply because she had read too much toxic news about her daughter and son-in-law. Hearing footsteps, Eleanor looked up. Seeing Richard, her eyes wavered slightly before returning to their flat calmness. Theodore's face immediately hardened. "Who let you come here?" Richard lowered his head. "I wanted to check on Margaret. You have the nerve to ask?" Theodore's voice flared with genuine fury for the first time. "If it weren't for you, she wouldn't be in there." Richard stood still, taking every word. Eleanor spoke up softly. "Dad?" Theodore looked at his daughter, suppressed his anger, and sat back down. The hallway fell back into a heavy silence. About half an hour later, the doctor stepped out. "Family of the patient?" Everyone stood up immediately. "The patient has passed the critical stage, but her heart is very weak. She must absolutely not be subjected to any further emotional distress." Eleanor practically exhaled her soul, bowing her head in continuous thanks. Theodore's relief was palpable. Only Richard stood in the background, feeling a weight heavier than before he heard the news. He knew exactly what had put Margaret in that bed. Shortly after the doctor left, a nurse permitted a brief visit. Eleanor and Theodore went in first. Richard stood outside the glass door looking through the white blinds, seeing Margaret lying on the bed looking so frail. His heart twisted in agony. A moment later, Margaret weakly turned her head toward the door, her eyes meeting his. Even from a distance, he could see her gently lift her hand, as if calling him inside. He froze. Theodore saw it too, looking displeased, but ultimately said nothing. Richard walked slowly into the room. As soon as he reached the bed, Margaret weakly grasped his hand. Her hand was ice cold. "Richard." Her voice was so faint it was barely a breath. He choked up. "Mom?" Margaret looked at him for a long time before asking softly, "Do you really not love Eleanor anymore?" The question instantly brought tears to his eyes. He lowered his head, his voice ruined. "I was wrong." Margaret closed her eyes for a few seconds, trying to gather strength. "Do you know? From the day she married you, she changed so much." Richard remained silent. "She used to love traveling, loved painting, loved gathering with friends. But after she married you, she devoted almost all her time to your family." Tears began to fall from Eleanor's eyes. Margaret squeezed Richard's hand slightly. "I used to think as long as you two lived peacefully, that was enough." Richard could not bear it anymore. His voice cracked completely. "I am so sorry, Mom." Margaret looked at him for a long time before sighing softly. You apologized to me, but the one hurting the most is her. No one spoke another word. The room was filled only with the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Right then, Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It was Harvey. She stepped outside to answer, and within seconds, her expression shifted entirely. What did you say? The lawyer's voice was urgent. Someone is shorting Sterling Global's stock in massive volumes. If this continues, the stock will hit rock bottom by tomorrow morning. Eleanor gripped her phone. Who is it? We are investigating, but it looks like a hostile takeover attempt by a rival firm. She stayed quiet for a few seconds, turning her head to look into the hospital room. Through the glass, she saw Richard sitting with his head bowed next to her mother's bed, looking more defeated than she had ever seen him. A strange sensation washed over her. The anger was still there, the pain was still there, but seeing the man like that, she felt more exhausted than hateful. At that same moment, Richard's phone rang. After hearing just a few words, he went pale. How much? Whatever the voice on the other end said made his hands shake. You cannot let them keep selling. He hung up and shot up from his chair. But as he took 2 steps, he staggered, clutching his chest. Eleanor gasped and ran over. What is wrong? Cold sweat poured down his forehead. Perhaps after going days without sleep, the relentless pressure combined with his mental collapse finally caused his body to give out. Theodore immediately called for a doctor. Richard looked at Eleanor with bloodshot eyes. Eleanor, I am so tired. It was the first time in years she had heard his voice sound so incredibly fragile. Richard was rushed to the emergency room that same night. The hospital corridor, already tense from Margaret's condition, now felt suffocating. Arthur stood outside, his mind in knots. Just a few days ago, his boss was a powerful man appearing on television with admirable poise. Now, the entire family was crumbling over a single affair. Eleanor sat perfectly still in the waiting chairs, her fingers interlaced tightly. When Richard clutched his chest and collapsed, she had run to catch him almost purely on instinct, without a second thought. Only after the doctors wheeled him away did she realize her heart was still aching in a way she couldn't quite define. Perhaps because she had loved that man so deeply. Theodore looked at his daughter for a long time before sitting down slowly beside her. Are you still worried about him? Eleanor stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering softly. I don't know. Theodore sighed. I am not forcing you to forgive him. I know, but you need to ask your own heart carefully. Eleanor lowered her head and said no more. Even she didn't understand what she was thinking. For the past 3 months, she had prepared meticulously for the divorce. She liquidated assets, transferred funds, gathered evidence, and told herself she would walk away from this marriage with absolute finality. But seeing Richard collapse in the middle of a hospital, she felt her chest tighten. Some feelings do not vanish after just a few days, especially when that person had been her entire youth. Nearly an hour later, the doctor stepped out of the emergency room. Family of the patient? Eleanor stood up immediately. How is he, doctor? Fortunately, he was brought in quickly. The patient is suffering from severe physical exhaustion and a massive spike in blood pressure due to prolonged stress. He is not in immediate danger, but he requires absolute rest. Arthur practically sighed in relief, and even Theodore's face softened slightly. Only Eleanor stood still for a long time before asking softly, when will he wake up? Probably in a few hours. After the doctor left, the hallway returned to silence. Outside, it was nearly dawn. The first pale rays of sunlight pierced the hospital windows, casting a chilling glow. Just then, Harvey called again. Eleanor, the situation is bad. She walked to the end of the hall to answer. What is happening, Harvey? Someone behind the scenes is intentionally trying to bankrupt Sterling Global. They bought media influence, are dumping shares, and spreading rumors of insolvency. She frowned. Which competitor? We suspect it is Hayes Enterprises. Hearing that name, her eyes shifted. Hayes Enterprises was Sterling Global's biggest competitor for years, but what surprised her was that its CEO was Julian Hayes, a man who had pursued her relentlessly before she married Richard. A wave of unease washed over her. Harvey continued. If they keep suppressing the stock price for another 2 days, the bank will absolutely pull their capital. She remained silent for a few seconds before asking, do you think it can still be saved? There is only one way. What is it? Someone must step in as a financial guarantor and restore market confidence. Eleanor closed her eyes. Just by speaking a word, she could change everything. With the Vance family's credibility, simply confirming they would continue supporting Sterling, Global would make the stock rebound immediately. But if she did that, she would be dragged right back into Richard's life. After a long time, she finally said, let me think about it. She hung up and stood silently in front of the glass window for a long time. Right then, a man's voice echoed from behind. "You are still the same as you were back then." She turned around, startled. Julian Hayes was standing just a few feet away. The man in his 40s wore a tailored black suit. His face was composed, but his gaze was sharp and unreadable. Eleanor frowned slightly. "Why are you here?" Julian smiled faintly. "I heard your mother was hospitalized, so I came to visit." She instantly knew it was an excuse. Julian looked toward the room where Richard was resting and spoke slowly. "It seems he truly is about to lose everything." Eleanor stayed quiet. "Are you planning to save him?" His voice was soft but carried immense pressure. She looked straight at him. "That is none of your business." Julian let out a low laugh. "Still protecting your husband like that? He is about to not be my husband anymore. But you still worry about him." The tension between the two suddenly spiked. Julian took a step closer. "Eleanor, you know very well that without you, Sterling Global will fall." She clenched her hands. "So what? You don't need to save him." Julian's eyes darkened. "You chose the wrong man back then." Eleanor's voice grew cold. "What are you trying to say?" Julian looked at her for a long time before answering slowly. "If you had married me back then, you wouldn't have to suffer like this." Eleanor turned away immediately. "That is in the past, but I have never forgotten." That sentence made her freeze for a few seconds. At that exact moment, a hoarse voice rang out from behind. "You have no right to say those things to my wife." Eleanor spun around. Richard was standing at the door of his hospital room. His face was still pale, but his eyes were colder than they had ever been. He had likely woken up a while ago and heard most of the conversation. Julian smirked. "How much longer will she be your wife?" Richard clenched his fists. "Whether we divorce or not, she has nothing to do with you." The two men stared at each other in a suffocating standoff, while Eleanor stood between them, a terrible premonition rising in her chest. She realized that everything had escalated far beyond a simple marital dispute. The hospital corridor sank into an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife following Richard's words. The harsh white lights reflected off the polished floor, illuminating three people locked in a confrontation no one wanted to concede. Julian looked at Richard for a few seconds and let out a dry laugh. "Do you even have the right to say that?" Richard took a step forward, his face pale but his eyes terrifyingly sharp. "No matter what happens between Eleanor and me doesn't need an outsider's interference." "Outsider?" Julian raised an eyebrow. When she was in her deepest agony, who was beside her? "You?" The air grew heavy. Eleanor spoke up quietly. "Enough." Both men turned to look at her. She stood still for a few seconds before speaking slowly. "I don't want to hear two men arguing in a hospital." Julian looked at her, his tone softening slightly. "I just don't want you to keep being soft-hearted." Richard's fists tightened. "Soft-hearted." He let out a raspy laugh. "I am the one who caused her this much pain. I know." It was the first time since the scandal broke that he openly admitted everything in front of someone else with such directness. Julian looked slightly surprised. Eleanor went silent for a few seconds. Richard turned to look at his wife, his eyes full of exhaustion. "I am not asking for your forgiveness anymore." She wavered slightly. "But I want to save the company myself. Not for the money, but for the people working there." Julian laughed mockingly. "Do you think it can still be saved? Even if there is a 1% chance, I will do it." The two men stared each other down again. But this time, Richard's eyes lacked their former arrogance. There was only the exhaustion and determination of a man trying to hold on to the last thing he had left. Right then, Julian's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and smirked. "It seems the game is getting interesting." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" Julian handed the phone to her. On the screen was the latest financial news about Sterling Global. A major group of shareholders had just announced a massive sell-off, plunging the stock price another 10% in less than an hour. If it continued, the company would genuinely collapse. Eleanor gripped the phone. Richard, standing behind her, looked worse than ever. He knew better than anyone that this was no longer a normal crisis. Someone was intentionally backing him into a corner, and very few people had the power to do that. He suddenly looked directly at Julian. "It's you, isn't it?" The hallway went dead silent. Julian did not answer immediately. After a long moment, he gave a slow smile. "What if it is?" Eleanor was stunned. "You are really behind this?" Julian looked at her for a long time before sighing softly. "Eleanor, you are too smart not to realize." Richard lunged forward to grab him by the collar, but before he could take a full step, a wave of dizziness hit him and he had to lean against the wall. Eleanor instinctively reached out to steady him. In that split second, both of them froze. Richard looked at the hand holding him, his heart aching violently. It was still her, No matter how much it hurt, she could not entirely abandon him. Julian watched the scene, his eyes visibly darkening. Even now, you still choose him. Eleanor let go slowly. I am not choosing anyone. But you are softening. Julian's voice betrayed impatience for the first time. From the very beginning, all he has done is hurt you. She remained silent. And what about you? The sudden question made Julian pause. She looked straight at him. If you truly care about me, why would you take things this far? The atmosphere dropped instantly. A long time passed before Julian smiled sadly. Because I want you to see clearly. See what clearly? That this man is not worthy of you. Eleanor closed her eyes for a few seconds. I have known that for a long time. That sentence left both men speechless. She continued, her voice light but overwhelmingly tired. But this is my marriage, not a battlefield for you two to declare a winner. Julian clenched his fists. I only wanted to protect you by destroying his company. She looked him in the eye. There are thousands of innocent employees there. Julian stayed silent. Right then, Eleanor's phone buzzed intensely. It was Harvey. Eleanor, the bank just sent their final notice. If a guarantor does not step in by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, they will freeze the entire line of credit. She closed her eyes. Less than 12 hours left. Richard stood in silence for a long time, then suddenly turned to walk away. Eleanor was startled. Where are you going? He didn't turn back. I have to go to the company. You haven't recovered. It's fine. His voice was hoarse. If it really falls, the least I can do is be standing there. With that, he walked slowly down the long, freezing hospital corridor. Eleanor watched his silhouette, her heart throbbing violently. 5 years ago, that same silhouette had stood in the rain outside her house for 3 hours just to beg to marry her. He was young then, possessing nothing but sheer recklessness and ambition. She had loved him so much she defied dejections. It was just a tragedy that after getting everything, he forgot how to cherish it. Just then, Theodore walked over from the end of the hall. He had likely heard most of the conversation. He looked at his daughter for a long time before speaking deeply. Are you really going to save him? Eleanor looked down, refusing to answer. Theodore sighed softly. You are just like your mother. She looked up. When you love someone, you just can't completely sever the tie. Hearing that, her eyes turned red. A long time passed before she asked softly, If it were you, Dad, what would you do? Theodore stood quietly, looking out at the gray sky through the glass, before saying slowly, If you can save the person you once loved without regretting it later, then save them. Her tears finally fell. Meanwhile, at the far end of the hallway, Richard's silhouette slowly vanished into the cold, white light of the hospital. The sky over San Francisco that morning was a murky gray, threatening rain. The top floor of Sterling Global had remained lit all through the night. In the grand boardroom, dozens of shareholders sat in silence, staring at the blood-red electronic ticker. The stock price was plunging by the minute. Out in the hallways, employees paced with unprecedented panic. Richard stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the city. In just a few days, the man who had always radiated confidence looked visibly thinner. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. But what had changed the most was his gaze. The arrogance was gone, replaced only by exhaustion. Behind him, the CFO reported in a raspy voice, Mr. Sterling, the bank just sent their absolute final warning. He closed his eyes. How much time? 2 hours. The room fell into absolute silence. Everyone knew what that meant. If a guarantor did not step in before the deadline, Sterling Global would officially default. When that happened, it would truly be over. A major shareholder suddenly stood up. I apologize, but I cannot go down with this ship any longer. Saying that, he placed his files on the table and walked out. The atmosphere grew even heavier. Richard remained perfectly still. He probably understood that in everyone's eyes, he was no longer the reliable CEO he once was. His phone buzzed. It was Arthur. Sir, Madam Eleanor is at the company. Richard froze and turned around. She's here? Yes. His heart pounded suffocatingly. Minutes later, the boardroom doors swung open. Eleanor walked in. She wore a simple white suit, her hair tied neatly back. Her face was still slightly pale from the recent stress, but her eyes were extraordinarily calm. The moment she appeared, the room practically held its breath. Everyone knew this woman was the only one capable of saving the conglomerate right now. Richard looked at his wife, his throat tightening. Eleanor. She did not look at him immediately. She slowly placed a thick file on the table and turned to the shareholders. I will act as the financial guarantor for Sterling Global's credit line. The room erupted into murmurs. One shareholder could barely believe it. Truly, Mrs. Sterling? She nodded slightly. The condition is that the entire financial executive structure must be reorganized under my authority. The board agreed almost instantly. In this situation, as long as the company survived, they would accept any condition. Richard stood paralyzed, staring at the woman before him. Even though he had guessed she might help, hearing her say it in person still made his heart ache. Because he knew better than anyone, she wasn't saving the company out of love for him, but because she couldn't stand to see thousands of innocent people lose their livelihoods. After signing the paperwork, Eleanor turned to leave. Just as she reached the door, Richard called out, "Can I have a few minutes?" The entire boardroom went silent, and everyone quietly filed out. Only the two of them were left in the massive space that had once been the site of so many plans they built for their future. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Richard said hoarsely, "Thank you." She smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me. I know I don't deserve this." He looked down. "But I probably will never meet another woman like you for the rest of my life." Her eyes flashed with red. Richard looked at her for a long time before continuing. "Over these past few days, I finally understood that the most terrifying thing isn't losing money or a company. It's losing the person who truly cared for you." Her throat tightened. He stepped closer but kept his distance. "I used to think you would always be there, no matter what I did." He gave a bitter laugh. "It wasn't until you truly turned your back that I realized how much of a fool I was." Outside the glass, it began to rain. The drops streaking down the window mirrored the heavy feeling in their chests. Eleanor stayed silent for a long time before asking softly, "If time could turn back, would you still betray me?" Richard didn't even need to think. "No, but time can't turn back." Those words made his eyes completely red. He understood that some mistakes cannot be fixed just by feeling regret. A moment later, she pulled a document from her bag and placed it on the table. It was the divorce settlement, already bearing her signature. "I have already signed." His hands shook as he looked at the paper. "You're still deciding to do this?" She gave a small nod. "We should stop while we can still maintain our last shred of respect." His tears finally fell. It was the first time in many years he had cried in front of her. Not for the company, not for the money, but for the woman he had, yet destroyed with his own hands. Eleanor looked at him, her heart aching a dull, persistent pain. Over the last few days, she thought she was strong enough to sever everything cleanly. But only in this moment did she realize that truly loving someone is never something you can just forget. It was just that some fractures, even if the love remains, can never be made whole again. She turned and walked toward the door. Just before stepping out, she paused for a few seconds and spoke without turning around. "Richard." He looked up. "Live a good life." Just that one sentence was enough to make him sob into his hands in the middle of the empty, sprawling room. The doors closed, and Eleanor's silhouette slowly faded down the long, bright white hallway. Everything had finally come to an end. 3 months later, the scandal of that year gradually settled. Sterling Global survived the crisis through a successful restructuring. Richard rarely appeared in the media anymore. People said he had changed completely, he spoke less, and was never associated with any loud affairs again. Eleanor moved to Aspen. She opened a charity for children with heart conditions named after her mother. Once Margaret recovered her health, Eleanor's life finally returned to a state of peace. Once Arthur went to visit her and quietly asked, "Madam, are you still angry with Mr. Sterling?" Eleanor looked out at the mountains for a long time before giving a sad smile. "I don't think I am angry anymore." "Then do you still love him?" The mountain breeze gently rustled her hair. A long time passed before she answered softly. "Having loved someone that much, you cannot just say you forgot and actually forget." Then she looked out into the vast horizon, her voice as light as the wind. "It's just that the person who walks with you to the end of your life isn't always the person you loved the most." Dear listeners, the story of Richard and Eleanor is perhaps not a rare one in today's world. There are marriages that look perfect from the outside, beautiful homes, luxury cars, endless wealth, but inside, they are filled with silences that outsiders never see. The most heartbreaking thing in a marriage isn't falling out of love instantly. It's when one person is still holding on, while the other assumes they will never leave. I truly feel pity for Richard. Not because he lost money or almost lost his empire, but because he only realized the value of the woman beside him after she was already gone. In this life, men often make one very common mistake. They think the person who has been by their side for years will never walk away. They get used to the care, the hot meals, having someone wait for them every night, having a safe harbor behind them, and eventually, they take it all for granted. But there is no sacrifice in this world that is infinite. Just because a woman can endure doesn't mean she isn't in pain, it just means she has been quiet for too long. As for Eleanor, I think what makes people respect her the most is that she maintained her grace even after being cut so deeply. Some people, when betrayed, will seek revenge to the bitter end. But Eleanor chose to save the company for the sake of thousands of innocent employees. That isn't just ordinary forgiveness. That is the true strength of a mature woman. But I also want to point out a very real truth. Forgiveness does not mean getting back together. Many people think that as long as they show remorse, they can start over. No, my friends. When certain cracks appear, no matter how hard you try to glue them back, the scars remain. The love might still be there, but the trust cannot always return. And regarding Chloe, she actually serves as a massive lesson. Youth often easily confuses love with the feeling of being spoiled. Expensive gifts and sweet promises can make someone feel special, but if a man can betray the person he shares a bed with one day, he will betray you too. No one can build true happiness on the pain of others. And the final thing I want to say to all of you listening to this story, if you still have someone beside you today who truly loves you, cherish them before it is too late. Do not wait until your home is filled with nothing but silence to realize how important the person waiting for you every night really was. If you enjoy emotional, real-life stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel to join us for our next episodes. Who knows, in one of these stories you might see a reflection of yourself, someone who once walked through your life, or learned something that helps you hold on to your happiness before it's too late.